Hi everyone, my name is Yasmin Lountchenko, and today I'll be presenting my Keystone on human rights and digital labor platforms. Before I get started, I want to say a special thanks to my advisor, Professor Lupuma from Questrom School of Business. None of this would have been possible without your support. So in the fall of 2022, hundreds of angry taxi drivers from across Europe stopped traffic in Brussels in protest of Uber, a popular ride-hailing platform. They brandished their European national flags as they gathered along the main street in a united front, and they placed tombstones in front of the European Commission's building, demanding the European Union to act now or don't cry later. The gathering followed the Uber files investigations in July 2020, which documented Uber's circumvention of regulations and their secret courting of lawmakers as they expanded their business operations across the European Union. The protests in Brussels signify a larger problem existing within the European Union. As new digital forms of labor continue to emerge, employment relationships have dramatically changed, fostering a degree of legal uncertainty as the lines between employment and unemployment are constantly blurring. While the expansion of the platform economy has benefited both businesses and consumers, it has created a gray zone for digital labor platform workers pertaining to their employment status, which is what I'm investigating in my Keystone. So the first research objective that I am answering in my presentation is what are the predicted impacts of the EU initiative on improving working conditions in digital platform work? And the second question is how can EU member states' case studies help predict the costs and benefits that key stakeholder groups may face? And the four main stakeholder groups that I look at within my research are the digital labor platform workers, the digital labor platforms, the consumers, and the EU member states. So first I want to start off by defining digital labor platforms. Essentially, it's the use of web-based platforms where work is outsourced through an open call to a geographically dispersed area, and location-based applications that allocate work to individuals in the specific geographical area. And this is typically done to perform service-oriented tasks. Some examples that you may all be familiar with include Uber, Uber Eats, Deliveroo, and TaskRabbit. Now, in the European Union, since the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, digital labor platform work has only expanded. We see that it has gone mainstream and has gathered pace due to its association with autonomy and flexibility. However, with the rise in this type of work has perpetuated a race to the bottom in which there are reduced social and employment protections. We see, as I've mentioned, that there's been this multiplication within this economy in the past few years. In the EU today, there are over 500 active digital labor platforms, and they're mostly concentrated in Western and Southern member states. However, with the rise of this economy has come poor working conditions and inadequate access to social protection due to incorrect employment classification. Out of the 28 million digital labor platform workers in the EU, 5.5 are estimated to be incorrectly classified as self-employed workers. Now, to address this issue, the European Commission has issued a draft directive on improving working conditions in platform work, which has been created in order to address the cases of misclassification for these workers, to ease the process through which they're reclassified as employees, which will then give them greater access to their rights as employees under EU law. So the proposal introduces two key improvements. The first is that it helps introduce the correct employment status of people working through platforms. And the second thing that it does is it establishes the first European Union rule on the use of algorithmic systems in the workplace. So with this, there comes several underlying consequences given implementation. The first group that may be affected includes the platform workers. Given that this proposal is implemented, they'll gain greater access to employment and social protections. However, we also see consequences to the platforms, the markets and consumers, as well as the EU member states. In my research, I conduct a case study on three countries. I look at Spain, France, and Italy, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will primarily be focusing on Spain. Now, in Spain, we see that there are a number of platform initiatives up to date, and they have about 15% of their workers are considered to be self-employed right now. And then in this presentation and through my research, I look primarily at the writer's law. So the Spanish writer law was introduced in 2021, and it had the goal of protecting the employment rights of digital labor platform workers who are specifically engaging in work in the delivery sector. It provides a legal presumption of employment as well as the right to information through algorithmic management systems. I chose Spain because they're the first country in the EU to establish a legal presumption of employment for their writers. Now, this legislation offers a preview of the potential effects of the Commission's proposal. After Spain passed this law, we see that Glovo has refused to compromise with the law. 80% of their workers are still hired on an independent contractor basis. Additionally, Uber responded by hiring several staffing agencies to hire a fleet of drivers for Uber Eats. They claim to have been faced with unfair competition with Glovo, who had refused to comply with the law. And then we also see that Deliveroo abandoned the Spanish market in July in 2021. So we're seeing several consequences of the Spanish litigation. Additionally, Courtney Timms, she serves as the general director of Uber Eats in Spain. She says that she has watched the government fail to enforce the rider law. It's creating a disadvantage for companies like Uber Eats because you have other companies who aren't complying with it, creating an unfair advantage. Now, additionally, many of the DLP workers in Spain have responded to the law. There are 3 main associations of riders within Spain, and they have shared their desire to maintain their self-employed status due to the associated independence and flexibility with this. They have voiced their discontent with the rider law in Spain. So in my research, the main thing that I conducted was this cost-benefit analysis as predicted from the Spanish initiatives. We see the first cost is to the digital labor platform workers. We see that some of the reclassified workers may lose independence and flexibility that they once enjoyed. Additionally, they may be dismissed due to high cost of employment or the platforms leaving the market. Though there are some benefits, we see that workers will have greater awareness of their individual and collective rights, and then up to 5.5 million across Europe can be reclassified and will gain access to social protection and employment rights. Now, the second stakeholder group I looked at was the digital labor platforms. As predicted from the Spanish initiatives, we see that some platforms will not comply, which will create an unfair advantage or disadvantage against those who do choose to comply. We also see that there are higher costs associated with employer contributions, and then some platforms may be forced to leave the market, such as like we've seen in Deliveroo. Though the benefits is that they'll benefit from the level playing field and reap the benefits of the single market, which is the European Union. And additionally, they'll benefit from increased legal certainty from employment. The legal presumption will mitigate the legal costs associated with proving employment, which will serve as a benefit for these platforms. Now, as for the consumers, consumers may lose access to on-demand goods and services due to layoffs, decreases in services, or some platforms leaving the market. And they may also be faced with higher service prices to compensate for the higher employment costs. Though the benefits is that there may be an increase in quality of services due to employee training benefits, which is required under EU law for employees. Now, the last stakeholder group are the EU member states. The cost to them is that national authorities may face a growing pressure for stronger enforcement of the directive to ensure fair competition, but they'll benefit from the revenue gained from social security and tax contributions paid by the employer digital labor platforms. So essentially, through the Spanish litigation and also the research I conducted both in Italy and France, we see that the proposed legislation will affect various stakeholder groups differently. We see that DLP workers can gain access to employment benefits and social protections while also losing freedom and flexibility. The platforms may face higher employment costs, but they'll benefit from the higher level playing field. The consumers may lose access to some of their services, but the quality of what is offered may improve. And then EU member states will face higher enforcement pressures while also receiving employer and employee contributions. But all of this is necessary to ensure that we are recognizing the multifaceted consequences of this proposed legislation. And again, with that being said, I just want to thank both my advisor, Professor Lupuma, the Kilachand Honors College community, and then multiple professors that I was able to speak with over the course of my research. Thank you.
Yasmin. Excellent work. We will now be taking questions.
I can start if nobody else. I was wondering 2 questions, actually. One was what kind of brought you, I guess, interested you in this topic specifically. I know I remember you working on your proposal for this. And then also, what challenges have you faced?
That's a good question. For the first question, I study international relations, and I always had an interest in international law. And while this project is not necessarily international law, but more regional, it took my legal interest, and then I combined that with my business interest as well. I took a class with Professor Lupuma. It was on international business, and I really did appreciate how it wasn't just limited to where I am now, but taking more of a global approach. And then my sophomore year, I took a class in it was intro to business. And 1 week we spent learning about the gig economy and how everything has sort of become commodified. So that introduced me to my interest of the platform economy, and then I kind of combined that with my interest in international law and international relations. As for your second question, the difficulty in this has just been also the global aspect of it. I think if I chose something more local in nature, I would be able to limit my scope and it would be easier to gain access to data. But while I was looking at 3 different countries, 3 different languages, and it's so far off, it was a little hard to kind of personalize it to my own understanding. That's good.
So what is the impediment to enforcing this? I mean, it seems like the law is there.
Right.
Why is it not enforced? What pressure is there, and by whom?
Yes.
To really make sure things are enforced?
That's a great question. So this directive has not been put into place yet. Currently, Spain is actively advocating for the legislation, while France is not. They're trying to water down the legislation, which was seen in that case study, as they do have a law implemented to sort of protect platform workers, though it's kind of been, many workers themselves deem it as a false attempt at social dialogue. So we see France and President Macron kind of watering down and trying to just oppose this new legislation. So it's not put into practice yet, though once it is, I believe states will have a year to put it into practice, and it will be monitored by the EU.
With the individual drivers, in your research, did you see like a divide in support based on whether they were using these programs as their primary income or supplemental income?
Yes, that's a great question. Now, for some of them, it's more supplemental in nature, and there is the chance that they won't be reclassified as employees, but some of them like the flexibility, like working longer hours in the middle of the night, and don't necessarily want someone controlling them as an employer. So some of them don't want to be reclassified as they enjoy that flexibility, and that's what initially drew them to platform work. While there are others who work more full-time, they work 40 hours on these platforms, they're already being controlled by the algorithms, so it already feels like an employment relationship is there, and they just want to gain access to those employee protections and social protections that come with employment classification.
I have a question. Do you know of anything like similar happening in the US or anything like different?
In the US, I think you told me about this on the other day. In California, I haven't fully looked into the initiative itself, but Sean was telling me about an initiative in California as they're trying to reclassify some of their platform workers more on a local level, not US level, but there are initiatives in place.
Follow up on that. Do you think that the U.S. would be informed by what's happening in the EU in terms of looking at the experience that they've had, or just going to say we're going to do it our own?
That's a good question. I think they may use, let's say this directive gets passed within the EU and all states comply, or maybe some fail to. I think the US will look to that to see the risk assessment of it, the costs and benefits, and that may inform the decisions on the US level. Though right now, on a national level, there doesn't seem to be much taking place where it's more state level, similar to the EU.
All right, thank you, Yasmin.
Thanks.